It is not your job as a husband to try to enforce God's standard with your wife. Her submission to you is between her and the Lord. You have a full-time job of loving her as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her.
Let's look at Ephesians 5 for a minute. And as we dive in, I want to ask you why you think, I'm looking at the passage here, and probably twice as much content is devoted to the husbands. And it starts with a very simple command: husbands, love your wives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what a great observation. I think it's so important. I'm pulling it up over here on my device, but I think it's so important that we recognize that more is said to husbands than to wives. And I think the greater difficulty for a husband, I think the sacrificial loving of your wife is maybe a harder responsibility. And wives may be going, well, that's because you don't have to submit to your husband. And I would go, yeah, but if he's loving you well and rightly, that should be hard. That's not something that should be easy. And I'll tell you a story. One of my favorite stories. Back when I was living in Tulsa years ago, I'd been married a couple of years. My friend Jeff, we were coworkers. We were out on a sales call together, and he'd been married for 6 months. I said, "How are you and Kathy doing?" He said, "Well, we're doing all right." I said, "So what's going on?" He said, "Well, she's having a hard time learning to submit to me." And I said, "Well, what makes you think she's supposed to submit to you?" He said, "It's in the Bible." I said, "Well, I got a New Testament in my glove compartment. Get it out." So he got it out. I said, "Show me where it is in the Bible." Now, I knew where it was. So he opens it up to Ephesians chapter 5. I said, "Ephesians 5, down there at verse 22, is that where you are?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "What does it say?" He said, "It says, wives submit." I said, "Stop. What's the first word in that verse?" "Wives." I said, "Are you a wife?" He said, "No." I said, "Well, you can skip that verse. That's not for you. God didn't write that to you. It is not your job as a husband to try to enforce God's standard with your wife, to say, you must submit to me. That's between her and the Lord. Her submission to you is between her and the Lord. You have a full-time job of loving her as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." And I know guys that say, "Yeah, I'd take a bullet for my wife." Yeah, will you sweep the floor for her?
Right.
Take a bullet's fine, but how many times are you going to get called on to do that? But every day, will you serve her? Will you give up your life for her? And then it goes on to say, and will you nourish and cherish her? So will you take care of her physical and spiritual needs? And will she know, that cherish word is a word of value. Does she know that she is highly valued and that she is highly esteemed? Before you ever talk anything about her responsibility to submit, you just make sure that your wife would know. Your wife would stand up to me and say, "I am so cherished by my husband. I'm the luckiest woman on the face of the earth because of how much I know he cherishes me." I've never met a wife who would say that and then would say, "But I'm not going to submit to him."
Right.
See, if we're doing our job rightly, a wife is going to, it's going to be so much easier for her to respond to our leadership in the marriage and in the home. And when she's not responding well, oftentimes it can go back to the fact that a husband's not loving well. He's not making it easy for her to submit. Now, it could be that she's just in sin and stubborn and full of pride. I mean, that's there. A husband can be loving and gentle and sacrificial, and his wife's just got a hard heart toward this. But most often when a husband is in a dedicated way, nourishing and cherishing his wife, laying down his life for her, a wife says, "This is the kind of man I want to follow and be with." And he hears my opinion. He hears my thoughts. He knows what matters to me. He takes all of that into account. And then Marianne and I have had this talk many times. I have said, "Okay, in this situation, do you want me to make this decision?" And she has said, "Yes, I do, as long as you make exactly the decision that I would make if I were making the decision." And we laugh about that. But there's part of her that's like, she is not sure that the decision that I'm making is the right one, but she's also not sure that the one that she thinks is right is the right one. She's insecure about both decisions. And so ultimately she has to trust the Lord and trust that God's establishment of this order is for her good and for his glory, and that even when I make a bad decision, and I've made them, that God's in the midst of that, and that he cares for us, and that he will protect us and guide us, and we can learn from that.
This episode of Rapid Response was brought to you by CTC Math. Visit them at ctcmath.com today.